Welcome back to your newest obsession, the NeuroSpicy MomPod. As always, I am your host, Austin Marie, and I am so happy you're here. If you're new around here, this is the little corner of the internet where we explore neuroscience, psychology, neurodivergence, reparenting, healing, and all of the messy, complicated ways those things show up in real life. My goal is to help you understand yourself with a little more compassion because when we understand our nervous systems, our stories, and the systems that shaped us, we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What do I need?" That one shift has the power to change everything. A few weeks ago, I was mindlessly scrolling on Instagram as one does when they are absolutely avoiding folding the laundry sitting in the dryer, and I came across a video of a Harvard student becoming emotional while talking about a longitudinal study that followed children growing up in Hawaii. The premise of the study was deceptively simple. Researchers wanted to understand why some children who experienced incredible adversity still went on to build healthy, successful, meaningful lives, while others struggled under the weight of those same circumstances. The student explained that although these children had poverty working against them, abuse working against them, addiction in their family, neglect, instability, and virtually every risk factor that developmental psychologists know increases the likelihood of poor outcomes, there was one common thread that kept appearing among children who defied the odds. They had an adult who believed in them. I immediately stopped scrolling because that one sentence transported me somewhere I hadn't thought about in years. So come with me on this little flashback. I promise it has a point. It took me 7 years to earn my degree in psychology. 7 years. We can get into all of the reasons why that was another time, probably in a paywalled episode. But after I had graduated, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I was hired straight from a college fair to be a recruiter at an IT firm and suddenly found myself living in the Bay Area, accompanying my sales manager to lunches with managers from Apple, Google, and LinkedIn. I knew I had stumbled into an opportunity that could have made me a lot of money, but I could never convince myself to care about it. If I'm honest, the dress code alone set me up for failure. I was uncomfortable every single day. Between the stiff business clothes, the fluorescent lights, the constant conversations, and rows upon rows of people packed into one office, my nervous system never stood a chance. Looking back now, I can laugh a little because it was basically an overstimulation stimulator disguised as a career. It didn't take me long to realize that money was never going to be enough to motivate me. I've always been someone who can work unbelievably hard when I believe in what I'm doing. The problem was that I did not believe in what I was doing, so I left. I became a nanny while I figured out my next step and eventually moved back to my college hometown. There, I found myself standing at a crossroads between becoming a therapist and becoming a teacher. There was one memory that ultimately made the decision for me. I was molested as a child, but I had repressed the memory until the end of my senior year of high school. Looking back now, there were signs that something was wrong, but because I have so few memories of my childhood, I honestly have no idea who noticed and who did not. One day, while talking with my mom about everything that had happened, she remembered something that had never meant much to her before. One of my elementary school teachers had asked to speak with her. The teacher had noticed that I refused to take off my oversized sweatshirt even on the hottest days. She noticed that I seemed to be trying to hide my body. I had gone through puberty very early, so my mom assumed it was just insecurity. Nothing more came from that conversation. When my mom told me that story years later, something inside me shifted. No one uncovered what had happened, no one had connected the dots, but someone noticed. Someone cared enough to pay attention to a change in my behavior. Someone saw a little girl who, in the only way she knew how, was raising a red flag. I cannot fully explain why that mattered so much to me, but it did. There is something profoundly healing about learning that your pain was visible. Even if no one understood it yet, someone saw enough to wonder if you were okay. That teacher had no idea that decades later, I would still think about her kindness. She had no idea that one conversation would influence the trajectory of my entire life. Because when I was deciding whether to become a therapist or a teacher, I kept thinking about her. I realized that I wanted to become the kind of adult who noticed, the kind of adult who looked beyond behavior and asked what story it might be telling, the kind of adult who understood that children are constantly communicating with us, even when they do not have the language to explain what they are experiencing. I wanted to be the person who noticed the invisible red flags. Years later, while researching for this episode, I learned that there is actually decades of developmental psychology supporting this kind of adult. The study I heard referenced online is called the Kauai Longitudinal Study. Beginning in 1955, psychologist Emmy Werner and her colleagues followed nearly 700 children born on the Hawaiian island of Kauai from birth well into adulthood. Some of these children experienced relatively stable childhoods, but many were growing up surrounded by poverty, abuse, parental mental illness, addiction, neglect, and chronic family stress. By every statistical measure available at the time, many of these children were expected to struggle throughout their lives, and many of them did, but not all of them. What fascinated the researchers was that approximately 1/3 of the children who had been considered the highest risk grew into capable, compassionate, successful adults despite everything working against them. Naturally, the researchers wanted to know why. Was it intelligence? Not necessarily. Was it luck? Not exactly. Was it because they were somehow naturally tougher than everyone else? Again, no. One of the strongest protective factors they consistently found was that these children had at least one stable, caring adult who genuinely believed in them. Sometimes it was a parent, sometimes it was not. Sometimes it was a grandparent, a neighbor, a coach, a teacher, or just another trusted adult. A title someone held mattered far less than the relationship they created. These adults offered something every nervous system desperately needs: safety, consistency, and belonging. The message they communicated was remarkably simple. I see you. You matter. I am glad you are here. Developmental psychology has spent decades teaching us that resilience is not something children are simply born with. Resilience is built in relationship. It develops when a child's nervous system repeatedly experiences safety, connection, and the unwavering belief that they are worthy of care. I think this is one of the most hopeful findings in psychology because it means that changing a child's life does not require being perfect. It does not require having all the answers or unlimited money or advanced degrees. Sometimes it begins with something much smaller: paying attention, remembering their favorite dinosaur, asking why they suddenly stopped smiling, noticing that they have worn the same sweatshirt every day for weeks, looking past behavior long enough to wonder what it might be protecting. That is what today's episode is really about, not just the science of resilience, but the extraordinary power of becoming the kind of adult who changes the trajectory of someone's life without ever realizing you did it. Because chances are, every single one of us can become that person for somebody. So let's put on our teacher hats for a minute because this is where I think the story gets even more incredible. When I first learned about the Kauai study, I remember thinking, well, of course having a loving adult helps. That feels almost painfully obvious, right? We all know that it feels good to be loved. We all know it feels awful to feel invisible. But what absolutely fascinated me was that this isn't just a nice idea. It isn't some fluffy parenting philosophy designed to make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Developmental psychology and neuroscience have spent decades demonstrating that our relationships literally shape architecture of our brains. Think about it this way. Human beings are one of the most helpless species on the planet when we're born. A baby giraffe is standing within the hour. Baby sea turtles hatch and immediately begin making their way towards the ocean while dodging predators along the way. Meanwhile, human babies can't even hold up their own heads. From an evolutionary perspective, our survival has always depended on other human beings. For hundreds of thousands of years, being separated from your family or your tribe wasn't just lonely. It was dangerous. If you were completely alone, your chances of surviving dropped dramatically. Our brains remember that. Even though most of us are no longer worried about wandering into the wilderness by ourselves, our nervous systems evolved during a time when connection meant literal survival. That ancient wiring is still very much alive inside all of us, which is why social rejection or neglect hurts so much. And I don't just mean emotionally. Researchers have actually placed people inside MRI scanners and intentionally created situations where they experienced social rejection. One of the most famous studies had participants playing a simple online ball tossing game. At first, everyone included them. Then, without warning, the other players stopped throwing them the ball altogether. Logically, everyone knew it was just a game, but their brains didn't care. The researchers discovered that when people experienced social rejection, a region of the brain called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex became active. That mouthful of a brain region is involved in processing physical pain, which means our brains use some of the very same neural networks to process the pain of exclusion as they do when our bodies are physically hurt. I don't know about you, but when I learned that, I had one of those moments where my entire life suddenly made more sense. Because how many of us have said things like, that breakup felt like it literally broke my heart, or I felt sick after they said that, or my chest is aching for them? Turns out you weren't being dramatic. Your brain was doing exactly what it was evolved to do. Now imagine it happening every single day while your brain is still under construction. Imagine repeatedly hearing things like, you're too sensitive, you're lazy. Why can't you be more like your sibling? What's wrong with you? You're so difficult. Or maybe the words were never spoken at all. Maybe no one looked at you. Maybe no one noticed when you came home from school. Maybe no one asked how your day was. Maybe the absence of love became the loudest message of all. Children's brains are incredibly different from adult brains. The parts of the brain responsible for reasoning, questioning information, and thinking critically are still developing for many years. Young children's brains also spend much more time in slower brainwave states than ours do, making them remarkably receptive to learning from the world around them. In other words, children are not miniature adults evaluating evidence before deciding whether to believe something about themselves. They're absorbing, they're watching, and they're listening. They're building an owner's manual for who they believe they are, and every interaction becomes data. If the adults around them consistently communicate, you're safe. Their nervous system begins to believe that the world is a safe place. If the adults around them communicate, you're capable. Their brain starts wiring itself around competence. But if they repeatedly hear, you're annoying, you're dramatic, or you'll never get it right, those messages don't just bounce off. The developing brain starts organizing itself around those beliefs. As my NeuroSpicy fam knows, one of my favorite concepts in neuroscience is something called neuroplasticity, which is simply our brain's incredible ability to change itself based on experience. Neurons that fire together wire together. That means every repeated experience strengthens a neural pathway. Think of it like walking through a field of tall grass. The first time you walk through it, you barely leave a trail. Walk the same path every day for months, and eventually, you've worn a dirt road into the ground. Our brains work in a surprisingly similar manner. The thoughts we think most often become the easiest thoughts for our brains to think again. The experiences we have over and over again become the roads our brains travel automatically. That is why children don't simply remember the messages they're given, they become them. And before anybody listening starts spiraling because you've accidentally lost your patience 17 times before breakfast, I want to gently pull us back into the hope in all of this. This is not about perfection. It never has been. What made the Kauai study so extraordinary wasn't that resilient children had perfect lives or perfect parents. They didn't. Many of them still experienced incredible hardship. What changed the trajectory of their lives was that somewhere along the way, they had at least one adult who consistently communicated something different. An adult who looked at them and reflected back a different story. Someone who said, I see you, I believe in you, and you matter. Those moments may seem small to us. To a developing brain, they are anything but small. They become evidence that the world can be safe, that relationships can be trusted, and that maybe, just maybe, the painful story a child has been writing about themselves isn't the only story available. I think that's one of the most beautiful things neuroscience has ever taught us. Every conversation we have with the child becomes part of the conversation they will eventually have with themselves. When we speak to children with kindness, curiosity, encouragement, and respect, we are not simply shaping their behavior. We are helping shape the voice that will one day live inside their own heads. And that voice has the potential to stay with them long after we're gone. As we wrap up today's episode, I keep coming back to one thought. What I love most about the Kauai study is that it fundamentally changed the question researchers were asking. Instead of asking, why do some children struggle? They asked, why do some children thrive despite extraordinary adversity? That shift matters because it moves us away from viewing resilience as something children either have or don't have, and toward understanding that resilience is something that can be nurtured. And according to decades of research, one of the most powerful protective factors isn't wealth, extraordinary intelligence, or a picture-perfect childhood. It was relationship. I don't know about you, but I find that incredibly hopeful because relationships are something we can all create. And that's the fascinating thing about being a safe adult. We rarely get to see the ripple effects of our own kindness. The moments that feel ordinary to us may become extraordinary to someone else. So, how do we actually apply this? I don't think becoming a charismatic adult requires some grand gesture or a perfectly scripted conversation. More often than not, it looks very ordinary. It looks like slowing down long enough to become curious instead of immediately becoming corrective. It looks like asking, I noticed you seem quieter today. Is everything okay? Instead of, what's wrong with you? It looks like remembering that behavior is communication, especially in children who don't yet have the language to explain what's happening inside of them. It looks like praising effort instead of identity. Instead of telling a child, you're so smart, we might say, I noticed how hard you worked on that. Instead of saying, you're such a good girl, we might say, I really appreciated how kind you were to your friend. Those may seem like small differences, but over time, they help children build an identity around things they can continue to choose and grow, rather than qualities they may one day fear losing. And maybe most importantly, it means remembering that repair is often more powerful than perfection. Every parent loses their patience. Every teacher has a hard day. Every caregiver says something they wish they could take back. What builds a secure relationship isn't the absence of mistakes. It's showing children that relationships can survive mistakes, that we can apologize, that we can reconnect, that love doesn't disappear when conflict shows up. I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give another human being. If you're listening today and realizing that you've never had your own charismatic adult, I want you to know that grief is real. There is something profoundly painful about recognizing what your younger self needed and didn't receive. But I also hope today's episode leaves you with something else, hope, because the same neuroplasticity that allowed painful experiences to shape your brain also allows healing experiences to reshape it. Our brains continue changing throughout our lives. Our nervous systems continue learning throughout our lives. The story doesn't end in childhood. And for me, that's the most hopeful part of all of this. You don't have to become the adult you had. You get to become the adult you needed. And this is going to take us into this week's journal prompt. This week's journal prompt is a simple one. Think back to your childhood and ask yourself, who made me feel seen? It doesn't have to be someone who changed your entire life. Maybe it was a teacher who always smiled at you when you walked into a room. Maybe it was a coach who believed in you before you believed in yourself. Maybe it was a librarian who always knew which book to hand to you next. Write about what they actually did. Not who they were, but how they made you feel. What did they notice? What did they say? How did your body feel in their presence? And if no one comes to mind, I want you to write about the adult you wish you'd had instead. What would they have noticed about you? What would they have protected? What would they have celebrated? Because my guess is that the answers to those questions aren't just describing the adult you needed, they're describing the adult you're becoming. Thank you, as always, for spending part of your week here with me. If this episode resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you'd follow the podcast wherever you're listening. Leave a review if your platform allows it, and share this episode with someone who you think needs to hear it. Those small acts genuinely help this little grassroots community reach more people. If you'd like to support the NeuroSpicy MomPod even further, you can subscribe for free on Patreon, or if you're in a season where you're able to financially support the show, A paid subscription helps me continue creating these episodes while raising my 2 kiddos. Every subscription, every share, every message, and every review allows this community to keep growing. And I'm so incredibly grateful that you're here. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and take care of your nervous system. Ta-ta!